I was really interested in understanding how the weaker side fights back. Choose your the area, including Kyiv Oblast. So basically, there's quite a lot of documentation of and evidence of weaponizing rape and sexual violence.
Based on what you've told about the similarities, if ISIS is a terrorist group, then Russia is a terrorist state.
The war in the Middle East basically served Mr. Putin in a way.
Вітаю! Сьогодні по завершенні Центральноєвропейського форуму спілкуємося у стінах Центру Шептицького Українського католицького університету із дослідником Омаром Ашуром. Я перейду на англійську, а ви зможете читати переклад у субтитрах. Dear Omar, thank you for coming here, and let's maybe start with the main question. Recently, I've seen lots of your publications and commentaries on Ukraine as a defense analyst. Though your main topic and the book, which will come out in Ukrainian soon, How ISIS Fights, is about another one. How did you decide to start researching Ukraine? And
Thank you first for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here, and I would rather be nowhere else. About the book, it's a personal story, and there is a more like a scholar curiosity story. So for the personal one, I saw a tactic employed by ISIS that made them take a very fortified position that was more or less other formations, conventional one, failed to take it. And ISIS an organization that was part of ISIS but never really said it was, managed to take that position in less than 10 minutes with a smaller force, very light force. And when I saw that, I was thinking a bit and trying to understand how did that happen. This is just, it's not even a strategy. It's a mere tactic, and it upset the military balance in a way that is unforeseen. The bigger picture, this is like the micro picture. The bigger picture was, I was really interested in understanding how the weaker side fights back. And ISIS was an extreme case in all aspects, not just ideology, but also in an aspect that this is a size or an organization almost always outnumbered, almost always outgunned, has no air defenses, has no air force, has no proper armor, has no proper artillery, and nobody likes it. In fight with almost every other organization and every other state, and doesn't fight in a rugged geography, and there's no state sponsorship, and there's no local sponsorship in a way. And then, despite all that, managed to take over 120 towns, cities, villages between southern Philippines all the way to Western Africa. But interestingly, I was not looking just as ISIS. The project started, actually, it was about weaker states. The state that has less resources, less population, less capacities, and gets attacked or gets in a war with a stronger one. So that was the initial project. So I was looking at 5 states and 5 non-states. And the non-state, one of them was ISIS, but then the amount of data I got grew so far too much. And then I had to write a whole book about it. But now I'm reversing to the other cases. And in the state side, one of the main cases is actually Ukraine. And this what brought me here in 2016 to study Ukraine's first counteroffensive in summer of 2014. The counteroffensive that liberated Kramatorsk, liberated Slovyansk, liberated Mariupol, liberated other towns and villages. And in a way, I wanted to understand that in more depth. So that's the story.
And considering your book, I will come back to it, in a prologue, as I know, to the Ukrainian translation to your book, How ISIS Fights, it will be written about the similarities of the tactics between Russian army in Ukraine and ISIS. as I understand.
Yeah.
So what are these similarities? Can you share with us?
So in the prologue, it was titled, it's based on a study that is still forthcoming, and it's going to be in English and Ukrainian, and it's with the title of How Putin's Army Fought Like ISIS in Ukraine, 2014-2022. And the idea there is actually started back to 2016 when I met some of the Ukrainian soldiers and volunteers and started talking to them about the project. Some of the soldiers who served in Crimea just started describing to me how Crimea fell. And while listening, I was just, wait a minute, because I heard this modus operandi or way of operating before. And I heard it and I saw it and I studied it in a place like Raqqa city in Syria in 2013. So how did Raqqa fell? Raqqa fell basically not by direct military action. There was a destabilization attempt inside the city, using various forms of false front organizations, various forms of kidnapping and assassinations at the opinion leaders and influential folks who may pose a resistance. There was a very strong intelligence mapping out of who's who can we bribe, who can we assassinate, who can we can switch sides to us, and so on. There was also more or less a series of terrorism acts, bombings and so on, to create enough instability. And once there was enough instability and terror in the city, ISIS just secured its victory with conventional here. There was no amphibious or air assault operations like the Russians did in Crimea, but it was mainly technicals. So cars with pickup trucks with heavy machine guns on them. And they were able to take Raqqa city like that. So the Raqqa city basically fell the first time in 2013 with a mix of terror tactics, information operations, and psychological operations. And that was about it. Now, fast forward to 2014, January 2014, you find like a series of infiltration operations of the security establishment and the civil society and the politicians. A series of attempts to map out the society, who's with us, we can, support him or her, who can we bribe, who can we assassinate and remove, and who can we put in jail. And also a series of false front organizations that claimed something and they were doing something completely different. A series of militias that were state-funded in a way. ISIS didn't have the capacity to do that. But also you have the destabilization, the information operation, the psychological operations that was created enough instability in the peninsula. And then after that, they secured the victory just with, they had their own bases there, including the Sevastopol, the naval base, but also other bases. And they did an amphibious and an air assault operation to just, not to bring about the victory, but to secure the victory, which is a very ISIS way to fight. But then we find more and more as, you go into the Donbass and you go also into Crimea, and fast forward to 2022, and you will find the following. In the Donbass in 2014, 2015, the Russian-led forces there used over 600 times improvised explosive devices. So in less than a year, they used IEDs. The masters of IED warfare are ISIS, but the level was not the ISIS level, but it was a little bit below. But they do use it quite effectively, including vehicle-borne, so car bombs, but vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, including remote-controlled ones, RISIDs, we call them. So quite a usage of the IEDs. Fast forward to 2022, and in Kyiv Oblast, I was told by the emergency services that they left behind over 18,000 IEDs, or unexploded ordnance, and other more or less forms of explosives, and some this is to cover their retreats and to cover the retrogrades. Some of these IEDs were left in places that has no military value whatsoever, like children parks or people's apartments. So just to cause damage, which is again that type of usage, either for the military purpose, the retrogrades, or to just harm people, is a very ISIS thing to do. And then also, again, we have an event today in the Catholic University about the weaponization of sexual violence. So the ISIS weaponized sexual violence in a very clear manner, especially against the Yazidis in northern Iraq. Russia did the same thing. Choose your town from Kherson to Kharkiv. Choose your the area, including Kyiv Oblast. So basically, there's quite a lot of documentation and evidence of weaponizing rape and sexual violence, more or less as a psychological terror tool, part of a psychological operation, and it's a very ISIS thing to do as well. And then add to that the abuse of religion. So rather than portraying religion as giving a very humane and bringing people together message, it was used as a divisive tool and a very polarizing tool, but also used by both Russia and ISIS in a way to mobilize and recruit. So for military purposes, for ISIS, they were the masters of taking religious texts out of their context, reinterpreting them, 7th century and 8th century religious texts, and then they reinterpret them, and then they use multimedia tools to attract followers to compensate for the losses. So they needed to mobilize and recruit. So they were very good at using this type of propaganda, religious-based propaganda, and they were successful. They recruited thousands or tens of thousands, depending on when and where, in terms of new recruits, and therefore this gave the organization a lifeline. In Russia, you find Kirill, the patriarch, the top head of the Russian Orthodox Church, blessing the head of the Rosgvardia, General Zolotov, despite what the Rosgvardia has done here, documented evidence, including the so-called Kadyrovites, who were members of the Rosgvardia. So that regiment is part of the Rosgvardia, at least in name. So basically, using religious symbols and religious figure to bless and mobilize new recruits and try to inspire them. The same thing happened in Chechnya. So Mr. Kadyrov is using his father's legacy, who was an official mufti of Chechnya, and he fought against Russia and switched sides, more or less to give some religious credentials to whatever he's doing. And the horrible picture of some of his followers chanting Allahu Akbar in Mariupol ruins, and behind them you see like a residential, nothing militarily, just a residential block. Probably there were babushkas and children living there, on the ground, and they're chanting religious slogans, which is very traumatic. But I think they were using this as a way to try to legitimate their actions, but also to mobilize new fighters for whatever they're doing. Well, also a very ISIS thing to do.
Yes, but based on what you've told about the similarities, if ISIS is a terrorist group, then Russia is a terrorist state.
Yeah, terrorism is used by Russia. Like it's very clear. So terrorism. Okay, so ISIS was many things, including a terrorist organization, but it was also ISIS. Ran cities and cleaned streets, and they had an administration, governance administration. They had an economic portfolio. So you can actually be whatever you are, but you can be a terrorist as well. So yes, Russia is using very terroristic methods, and this has legal implications, but international law is not catching up. So international law now is producing more and more legal measures against non-state forces using terrorism. So you have sanctions against them, you sanction against the people. You can try them, you can put them on basically put them in jail, because of criminal matters. Sometimes even some states do targeted killing, so they finish. But in the case of Russia, it's a state, it's a nuclear state. So I don't know if if there will be a change in that legal dimension if a state is using terrorist methods, and it's very clear and well documented, not just by my study, but by human rights organizations of various types and other governments as well. There has to be implications for that.
Also knowing, so you've compared knowing the Russian and ISIS tactics, can we guess about some good counter tactics of what Russia is doing?
The counter tactics, basically, first you need to prevent, right? So this means building up your defenses, but this is before the fact. We're already in the fight, but building up your defenses and investing in your security forces. The counter tactics that was used against ISIS, part of it can be used against Russia, but not all of it. So part of it means they had basically 4 pillars against ISIS: the air campaign, the partners on the ground, because the Americans did not want to fight face to face, so they had partners on the ground to fight with their assistance, whether it's the Iraqi forces or the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, or others. And then they had also the third pillar, which has to do with the targeting the information and the hybrid campaign, if you wish, like the information operations and psychological operations. And then the fourth is fixing the structure, because ISIS did not grow up out of nowhere. There was a structure, there was societal and broken politics behind its growth and expansion. So if you took some lessons from there, well, the air campaign, we've been talking about. General Zaluzhny had a long essay where he stressed the importance of just air parity, or air superiority. Parity, nobody wants parity, because parity will keep you as you are, but you want superiority to be able to advance. So the importance of air superiority, I think everybody realizes that now. But also the addressing of mobilization issues in terms of the reserves. So this is like the partners on the ground, if you wish, or the soldiers in this case. But also you need more partners. You need to expand your partnerships and your friends, your list of friends and allies, because in a way, in a very interesting way, Russia is fighting now with North Korean munitions, and we're fighting with South Korean munitions. So it's which tells you, it's very important to expand your friends and alliances, because once the South Korean munitions are done, then you need to find partly local, but also expand out of that. But also the counter propaganda. The counter propaganda is very important, whether in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine. And the political environment that brought about Mr. Putin, this is for the long term, will need also to change. At some point, this will have to be addressed. Probably not just Ukraine, but Ukraine and all of its partners, perhaps with members of the Russian opposition as well. But that environment that brought about the situation that we have now did not come out of nowhere, and it's clearly there's a domestic political Russian issue that brings about that behavior towards their neighbors, because it's not the first war, as we all know.
Well, speaking about the partners, so I will ask about more broader issues. Well, Ukraine has developed over the last years some relations in the Middle East, and now with the war in the Middle East, war Israel against Hamas, it is in a challenging position. What would be your advice for the Ukrainian diplomacy on which positions to stay, so that to preserve those partnerships that we already have, that we already had in the region?
My advice, that I repeated it multiple times to officials and to colleagues and to academics, is basically stick with international law, stay consistent. So you can it is important to condemn terrorism, and it is important also to condemn occupation, forced deportation, and so on, colonial settlers. And it's most important is to find a way out of, in terms of if you're talking about the Middle East, a strategic peace deal that can last in the context of the two-state solution. That's the main message. If you became select, because to be very clear, with Ukraine, Ukraine suffered from occupation. It is fighting a war of liberation. It has a significant percentage of its population was forcibly deported from the occupied areas. And you're suffering from colonial settlers in Mariupol, in Crimea, elsewhere. So in Crimea, the numbers are very high. So this is the story of many places in Africa, in the Middle East, and in South Asia. Therefore, you will have a lot of sympathy and support when these issues are stressed, and they should be stressed as part of a strategic communication policy in that sense.
Well, just recently, I've heard that Jordan's foreign minister appealed, when he appealed to the European states, he called them to have the same support against Israel war crimes in Gaza as this support was previously towards Russian war crimes in Ukraine. How often do you hear now, since the 7th of October, how often do you hear relevance of the Russia-Ukraine war and the war between Israel and Hamas?
So on one end, you had the war in the Middle East basically served Mr. Putin in a way, in actually many ways. So one way it served him, it took away the media attention completely. So you had local Middle Eastern channels in Arabic, not just in English, in Arabic, covering Ukraine 24/7, with correspondence in multiple places in Ukraine. So it brought Ukraine home, to the homes of the Middle Eastern families and so on. So that's one. But that could completely change now. Ukraine is not on the map. It's like it's the focus is basically on Gaza and what's happening with the Israeli forces. But also there's another bit which is the comparisons. So people don't know the background. Many of the so-called, it's a wrong term and I don't like it, and it's very misleading, but for lack of an alternative, between quotations, the so-called Global South, they don't know much about the history. They don't know about the Holodomor. They don't know about the Soviet legacy here. They don't know about the war of 2014. Many of this stuff escapes them. But what they see is, babies killed and children killed in Gaza, and no condemnation, but also these war crimes, when it committed here, there's a lot of condemnation. So they see here, they see the double standard. And this has been, this started from the very beginning. And you try to tell them, okay, regardless of you don't have to be, to follow the double standard, right? You can have your own position and say, the Ukraine is under occupation, is suffering from multiple war crimes. And you can condemn what's happening in Gaza, the occupation, the killing of children, and so on. It's, there's no I have to choose here between which war crime I have to condemn. And the same applies for the officials. So this is for for the people, but the same apply for the governments and for the officials. So we'll see how this escalates. But if it keeps on going, clearly it's not helping the international rule-based order that Ukraine and every other state would probably prefer to be respected.
You've mentioned that Putin uses this war in the Middle East. So taking this into consideration, what should be the best approach for Ukraine and the EU states so that to omit these double standards in this situation so that to preserve this good relations and relations with the countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, two issues there. Basically, we need a very consistent strategic communication policy among all your institutions, your governmental institutions. And this strategic communication policy should be basically looking at what the Russians are doing, or reflecting what the Russians are doing here, and commenting on it in terms of the war crimes and the documentations and so on. But also, when asked to comment on the rest of the world, be quite aware of the details of what's happening. So just don't take just one picture at one time frame, for example, 7th of October, and then forget before and after. Or, I don't know, 29th of October, and then forget before and after. The more comprehensive, and then more reflective of the Ukrainian principles, which are very clear on democracy, respect of human rights, the respect of international law. More or less the 10 points that President Zelensky mentioned in his peace deal, just to be reflected, not just for Ukraine, but also for everybody else who is in similar situation.
You mentioned Arabic channels that were reporting 24/7 on Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. What made their interest? I mean, the huge, because this is the huge war, or were there any interests that provoked Arabic audience to listen to what's happening here?
Part of it is it is a huge war. Part of it has affected everybody, including issues with energy security, issues with food security all over the globe. Part of it is many of these countries are very small countries, and they are neighbored by larger ones. So they see, I was saying, if some of the countries including Qatar, for example, the heart is definitely with Ukraine, but then the mind is feeling Russia. Why is the heart with Ukraine? Because they were in similar situation. They almost got invaded before by a larger state. A state like Kuwait was invaded by a larger state, Iraq, before, and always threatened by bigger neighbors. And then there you go. This happens in the middle of Europe. A larger state invades a relatively smaller state and tries to occupy its land with a horrendous series of war crimes conducted. So yeah, this would get their attention, because if, God forbids, Russia is victorious here and gets away with it, I think every other small state will be in a much weaker position, whether in the Middle East or anywhere in the world, because they will look at their bigger neighbors, will be seeing what Russia has done and thinking, maybe we can take a piece and get away with it, or take the whole country and get away with it. And there's lots of claims of that, and the military capability can be sold and so on. If Russia fails, I think many will be thinking about back to hybrid. Unfortunately, Russia in Crimea, using ISIS-like tactics, hybrid tactics, and in part of the Donbass, it was relatively victorious and low cost. So they got Crimea, they got away with it, they annexed it, they got away with that with limited sanctions. In the process, the one SDF, one self-defense militiaman was killed, so they didn't lose any soldiers. And then the sanctions actually came after MH17, the serious sanctions came after MH17, yes, because European women and children were killed over the Donbass. And then, so that worked 100%. When they tried the conventional way, of course they tried hybrid as well. They tried to destabilize the situation in Kyiv, but they were not very successful. But then they tried the conventional way by sending their troops. The losses now are, we're talking about basically at least the entire force that attacked Ukraine on 24th of February 2022 is destroyed. So if the losses are 150,000 or more, that's the force that attacked Ukraine basically in that period. So between dead, wounded, POWs, missing, and defected. So the conventional way was extremely costly. So I think if when it loses, because this is when Russia loses, not if, I think many will be thinking about hybrid warfare again, because it was not always successful. But in Crimea, it was 100% successful. In the Donbass, it was 50-50. In a place like Kharkiv, it was Kharkiv People Republic lasted for 12 hours. So it was declared 7th of April and toppled down to 8th of April 2014. So it didn't last long. So it was zero success, so 100% failure. But it's less costly. It's a very effective way to fight and a very cheap way to fight. And therefore it may be repeated. So even when this ends, when Ukraine is victorious, you will need to shore up both your conventional and your hybrid defenses.
And my last question, because we are speaking now about smaller states against bigger states. So, and speaking about in the premises of Ukrainian Catholic University, how to make the contemporary David the most effective in his fight against Goliath?
This is how much time do you have? That's a whole conference. Well,
it's in 3 questions, in 3 sentences. Let it be so.
Well, you in 3 sentences: leadership, people, and army. You need the very quality leadership that can inspire, to raise the morale, to raise the bravery. You need your investments in your armed forces, which is basically, we're talking about it depending on which is the way you want to fight, because now we need strategies about making choices. So you need to think which way you want to approach. You want to fight as a combined arms army, such as the way of the NATO, and therefore you invest more in your air forces and others. Or you need to fight the way you fight right now, which is an artillery-intensive army, and and therefore you need an expansion of your artillery tools and munitions. And so, but overall, whichever way you're going to go, your defense, the part of the budget allocated for defense needs to be more than 2%, which is the recommended NATO's barrier. And most importantly, the people. Without the people, I think what saved Kyiv is that Ukraine had a people's army. Everybody was actually what is saving and protecting Ukraine until today is that it has a people's army. Everybody is. You see many folks who are just collecting money for buying drones, for buying equipments, for medical kit and aid. And it's like everybody is involved. So you have over 40 million people who are involved in the support. And so this is to be very generic, but there are a lot more details to talk about. But this is what made many countries who are smaller, weaker, succeed in a way, by this combination of leadership, army, and people.
Thank you. Thank you for coming here and that you agreed for this interview.